Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 322. In this episode, I'm joined by Andrew Snyder of the Mythic Mind podcast. Andrew lives in Williamsburg, Virginia, with his wife and twin one-year-olds. He is a PhD student of theology, and this spring he will be defending his dissertation on the integrating role of faith in Kierkegaard's psychological narrative of self-formation. He's an adjunct professor of philosophy and religion, a contributing author to the Holy Spirit and the Reformation Legacy, and host of the Mythic Mind podcast, which explores the intersections between philosophy and stories. Andrew, welcome to the Tolkien Road.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, before we dive in, I'd like to give a double up Bear 5 to our patrons. Andrew, I'd like to invite you to join me as I do this. I don't know if you are familiar with this custom of ours. But we give a double up Bear 5 to our patrons. All right. So patrons, hands up there. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsh, whoopsh. Nice. Very nice. All right. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., and Eru27. And a shout out to our newest patron, Shana Supreme. So thank you so much to our patrons. Please check out patreon.com/TolkienRoad to learn more about how you can support what we're doing over here. All right. And hey, YouTube, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. All right, Andrew, we were just talking before I hit record. We've been meaning to do this for a while. I was kind of chuckling about that because, I think we've been acquainted with each other for several years, I believe. I mean, I think I've been following you on Twitter, for a long time, I think, and we've interacted a few times over there. And then earlier, well, now it's 2023, but in early part of, or maybe first half of 2022, there was a there was an article that came out on Medium that I think pushed a button for each of us, and it was this. It basically, I can't even remember who wrote it or what the gist of it was, or like what the fine points of the argument were at this point, but it was basically saying like, Lord of the Rings is not a Christian work. And I think both of us would probably say like, okay, it's not a Christian work, like in the sense, I think in your article, you talk about like PureFlix. It's not like a Christian work in the sense of like, you're not gonna see it made into a film on PureFlix. Yeah, and probably I wouldn't be interested in it if you were, but it's, we both were like, but you're not understanding where Tolkien's coming from. And you wrote a really great article to that effect, and it got shared a whole bunch, I think, kind of as a response to that, to the original article. And it was quite excellent. So I want to revisit that topic here in just a bit. But I was hoping we could just start off by, letting you tell everybody about Tolkien and your journey, and or your journey with Tolkien in your own life, and about what you're up to in your life as far as things relating to Tolkien.
All right, fantastic. First of all, I'm so glad to be doing this. I've been listening to your podcast since even before I started reading Tolkien.
Oh wow,
so
that's awesome.
Yeah, and so I'll get into that in just a little bit. So yeah, unlike probably most of the guests you've had on, I don't have a long history with Tolkien. In fact, growing up, I really wasn't that much of a reader at all, aside from some anomalies here and there. I mean, toward the end of high school, I kind of started reading, theology, and I studied philosophy and theology in school. But honestly, I just didn't really recognize the value of reading fiction. And so I didn't. I figured I'll just watch a movie or something if I want a story. I didn't quite get the whole, escape, consolation, and recovery idea that Tolkien in a sense taught me. But I think that during my master's degree, I took a course on Augustine. Reading Augustine's Confessions really helped me to better understand kind of myself and my own sort of spiritual and psychological narrative, which I think in turn sort of primed me to value narratives more, to value stories more. Now, fast forward a few years, between 2019 to early 2021, my wife and I had 6 consecutive miscarriages.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, by far one of the darkest, most difficult times of my life.
Did you
There's
say 6?
nothing like it. 6,
6
yeah,
consecutive miscarriages. My goodness.
yeah.
Oh,
So, but I mean, perhaps surprisingly, I mean, that's also one of the most profound seasons of growth kind of in my faith and really my engagement with the world. It was sort of in that sorrow that, I experienced greater unity with, the crucified Christ. The idea that, the wounds of Christ are able to hold our sorrow with the hope of joy. But anyways, obviously that was a struggle back and forth during that time. And I don't quite know what it was, but I was on Twitter one day, and something from Kaitlyn with Tea of Tolkien or Tea of Tolkien popped up on my feed, and whatever reason I followed. I kind of started to listen to her podcast a little bit, and then I was thinking, well, this is kind of interesting. I watched the movies when they came out, but that's sort of it. And then I decided to see, well, what other Tolkien podcasts are out there. Surprisingly, the answer is a lot. As I've come to learn. But yeah, so after hers, I mean, yours was the next one that sort of popped up in my search, and I before even reading Tolkien, I listened through your series on the Silmarillion, and beyond, and then I don't know, a couple years later, 2021 or so, really halfway through 2021, sort of on a whim again, I decided to go on Amazon, and I order Lord of the Rings, and showed up at my door, and I start into it, and I just can't read it quickly enough.
so that's so interesting. So like you were just kind of magnetically drawn to Tolkien followers, it sounds like, to people who were talking a lot about Tolkien. But you like, I mean, I had you seen the films, and like that was an interest?
I mean, I saw the films, and I don't know, I guess probably middle and high school would be around that time. And I liked them well enough, but that's sort of where it left off until just recently.
Yeah.
And then, somehow I just sort of drawn into this world. And I think that one thing that really drew me in at just the right time is the significant role that I think sorrow plays in Tolkien's world, and the idea how it is intermingled with hope, and ultimately joy. And, that comes out in, a number of iconic quotes throughout his legendarium, the interweaving of, sorrow and joy, and something in that deeply spoke to me exactly when I needed it. And so I just kind of went all in, not just in this is a great story, but in something much more existential. I felt like Tolkien was writing something true, even before, I went a little bit further and was able to articulate that a little bit more in Tolkienian terms.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, that's so true. Like you get to the point in Lord of the Rings where you're just like, I mean, there's stories, and then there's this. Like this is something is going on a higher level here. And there you go. Like that's what got me down this road. It started in 2015, and just can't seem to find a way to stop talking about it. So it's beautiful. Yeah.
And so I just went, straight from Lord of the Rings, picked up Silmarillion. I decided to take a little break and read a little Dostoevsky, but before I even finished that,
I'd light reading.
Yeah, a little light reading.
Yeah.
But before I even finished that, I already had Tales from the Perilous Realm on the way, and then the Great Tales after that, and just kept going.
Yeah. Wow. So, whenever like it's you're talking about the the 6 miscarriages, and just the dark time that put you through, and whenever I think like, but in connecting that to Tolkien, right? Connecting that to Tolkien, I realize like how all of Middle Earth came out of, I mean, an incredibly kind of, well, I'll say incredibly because it's certainly not to the level that I've ever experienced this, but between World War I, both of his parents dying when he was young, and finding himself orphaned, and just in general the horror of World War I. I mean, it ties so much of it together as well. Yeah, it's like out of all of that somehow came these incredible stories, right? It's such an amazing and beautiful mystery to sort of ponder that, and how so often that's where great creative works come from. Well, so that's wonderful. So I'm really interested in, now that you mentioned the Tales of the Peril. Is it Tales from or Tales of the Peril? I feel like I want to mix it up with Tales
I
from
feel like it's from right. Right.
Tales from the Perilous Realm. Okay.
Wait, Tales. Now I'm double thinking it.
I know. All of a sudden, I've never
Yeah.
I've never like
Right.
questioned myself on this before.
Right.
Well, whatever it is,
Yeah.
tales. They're tales, and they have to do with the Perilous Realm.
Right. Right.
So you're going to be exploring that
Mhm.
on your podcast this year. That right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So
Yep,
this
that's
is
right.
I want to talk about, some of those, and it's really interesting because I feel like for those who have listened to this podcast for a long time, you'll know that I love Leaf by Niggle, and I love On Fairy Stories, which is, I think it's like an appendix in
Mhm.
Tales from the Perilous Realm. Um, and then I've been preparing to do an episode on Smith of Wooten Major, which I'm planning to do soon, but I keep on having to push it out further because I'm just kind of like, what is going on here?
That's
I feel like
fair. Yeah.
Leaf by Niggle is like, it's just like, oh, just put it in my veins. It just speaks so
Mhm.
deeply to me. And then Smith of Wooten Major, I'm just kind of like, Tolkien wrote this, so there's something going on here that I need to pay attention to. I just am not sure what it is yet. So,
Yeah, I'm honestly not quite there myself.
yeah, it's a challenging one. And then of course
Yeah.
Farmer Giles of Ham, which it's been a couple of years since I've read it, and that's gonna be another one that I remember being like, I'm like,
Mhm.
this doesn't quite do it for me on the level of Leaf by Niggle, but it's Tolkien, so I know it's brilliant, so I'm going to make sure I pay close attention.
Yeah, I'm still questioning how I'm going to have a brilliant exposition of Rover Random, but it'll be a fun one at least.
Yeah, Rover Random. That's another. I kind of feel like Rover Random was like, yeah, I Rover Random is kind of like there with Letters from Father Christmas. It's kind of like
Right.
maybe there's something going on here, but I kind of feel like it's a little more like he was just telling like literally telling a Shaggy Dog story to his kids, and it just turned into this thing.
Right. But I mean, ultimately, there has to be some truth behind all engaging stories, or they wouldn't resonate with us, even on a entertainment level. There's always something there.
That's true, and that'll be the fun of going through, even Rover Random is just being kind of like,
Mhm.
what's going, because when you read it, if you're well versed with the deeper parts of the legendarium, you realize that there are, and the same is true of Smith of Wooten Major, which is like, but
Mhm.
there's lots of overlap with the themes of Middle Earth, and literally there's like almost times where you're like, wait, that's a character from Middle Earth right there that he just brought in brought into this.
Yeah, it was exciting when I read River Random fresh out of the Silmarillion, and he approaches Valinor at one point.
Right. Yeah, there's a place, right?
Right.
Um, yeah, and the same thing happens in Smith of Wooten Major. So for some reason
Mhm.
he could never completely get away from Middle Earth. I suppose because it
Right.
is his perilous realm.
Right.
It's truly his perilous realm. Well, Andrew, tell us a little bit about the Mythic Mind, your podcast that you've
Mhm.
been at for about a year and a half, and feel free to kind of
Mhm.
connect it to your other. I know you write over on Substack, so feel
Mhm.
free to connect it to just everything you got going on in this world of
Mhm.
studying myth.
Yeah, and so I'm kind of moving a lot of different directions at once. Right now, there's definitely a strong Tolkienian theme kind of across the board.
Mhm.
But really, with my podcast, it's really looking at the intersection between philosophy and stories, and primarily literature, at least up to this point. And so, the first season really was a presentation of my dissertation material, sort of going through some Kierkegaard's, psychology of kind of anxiety, despair, and kind of the role of faith in forming the self. And so, that was kind of easy for me because I'd already done the work more or less. But at this point, I'm really diving into fiction, starting with Tales from the Perilous Realm, and that's because I knew I wanted to do something with Tolkien, and I feel like there are enough strong voices out there on Lord of the Ring, on the legendarium essentially. And so I wanted to focus on something a little bit different. And so yeah, so I'm really diving into the Tales from the Perilous Realm. I'm still shaping up exactly what that looks like, but I'm bringing in a lot of really interesting guests. Up to this point, I've done it pretty much entirely by myself, which is fun. But I definitely look forward to, I've got like 7 or 8 people lined up for this next season, so that'll be a lot of fun. Over on Patreon, I'm doing a lot over there as well. I'm actually wrapping up a series I'm doing there on Grimm's fairy tales, which is kind of fun. And so,
Nice.
I've been reading through Grimm's fairy tales and, providing some kind of exposition and really, reflection. The whole idea is reading myths and fairy tales for wisdom.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's been a lot of fun. Over on Substack, just at the beginning of this year, I started doing some summaries and reflections on Tolkien's letters. Which, if you've never read Tolkien's letters before, I would highly recommend it. There's just so much there.
Yeah.
So much practical wisdom,
Yeah.
in addition to obviously insights in his storytelling.
And that's awesome. Like, you're so right. For those who are longtime listeners to my podcast, they'll know I just adore his letters. There's so much, there's just so much richness in his letters from a just nerd out on Middle Earth perspective alone. There's the Waldman letter basically explains the whole legendarium to you, but then there's these other incredible letters where he just says the most profound and deep truths, things that I'm still trying to kind of like understand the richness of what he was all about. Yeah, so that's really cool. I'm definitely gonna be listening to those to those episodes focused on Tolkien, and I'm very interested to hear when you get to Smith of Wooten Major what your take on that is, because I'm gonna be doing my own episode, like I said, and then the letters. I'm very interested to see which letters you're gonna be talking about, because there's a lot of them and they're so good. So yeah.
Yeah. One thing I really love about them is, in addition to seeing, his wisdom and the, background of his stories, is I even love just the really mundane letters that just show that he's a real person.
Yeah.
It's easy to kind of mythologize Tolkien.
Yeah. On that note, like I found myself recently, maybe like a month ago, I found like one of the old BBC specials they did on him on, when he was still alive, and they actually interviewed him. And like, I was like tearing up as I watched him, because it was just so beautiful. Like, I was just like, he's just like, the complete opposite of phony. Like,
Right.
he is just so totally himself, and he's beautiful. Like, he just has a beautiful soul. Like, it was really amazing just to watch him. And he just kind of goes through and just has this like very like grandfatherly smirk on his face the whole time, and I can't remember. I feel like the one I watched was, it was a particular interview where the guy's a little bit more, he's a little younger, and he's he's a BBC guy, so he's very worldly and everything like that. And Tolkien is just, he's very like cordial with him and everything like that, but he gives him these like kind of mind-blowing answers to different things, but it's just kind of like, yep, that's how it is. Yeah, that's how I see it. Yeah.
Right.
It's wonderful. All right, so let's come back to this topic of Christianity and Middle Earth. So do you remember the name of the individual who wrote the article, just off the top of your head?
I feel like it was
one of us prepared for this.
I feel like Paletti, Jonathan Paletti. Pretty sure Paletti was his last name.
Okay, yeah. Jonathan Paletti. Okay, and I mean, the gist of this article was essentially like, he was, if I recall, he was basically coming at it and saying, like, if anything, Lord of the Rings is like an anti-Christian. It was almost like he was saying it's like an anti-Christian work. He was trying to make the case that it was.
Right. No, I didn't review it recently, but from what I recall, I think he basically argued that it's rooted in paganism and essentially promotes some kind of like secular progressivism or something along those lines.
Yeah, and you just did a great job of, I think, going through and kind of point by point and refuting a lot of what he said. I think there was a lot of, there were times that I read the article and I was just kind of scratching my head and being like, is this guy serious, or is this some kind of like, is he trolling us? And there may have been a little bit troll action going, but I think it was also pretty, there may have been some trollery going, but I think he was also kind of serious in general about his argument. But I think I guess I'm interested to kind of like hear you explain your take on just how Christianity and Lord of the Rings work together, because it's this ongoing thing, right? And like I said at the beginning, neither one of us would probably say like, it's an explicitly like, Christian work. I think we certainly wouldn't say it's like some kind of like direct allegory, for Christianity, but there is something utterly Christian about it, and Tolkien himself, I think, would have agreed with that statement. There's the whole fundamentally Catholic and religious work, kind of hard to get around that. But I mean, how do you explain that to people? How do you explain that to people that this is how Lord of the Rings is Christian? Like, what would be your approach to doing that?
Yeah, and so I mean, on one hand, Tolkien does come out and say it is a Christian work, right? He says it is a fundamentally Catholic work, and I remember the article even cited Tolkien saying that, the fact that Tolkien says, I'm sure you could quote it more exactly, but that first it was unintentional and then it was intentional, the Christian influence behind his work, and then the Paletti referenced that to say, see, Tolkien didn't intentionally make it Christian, which is a weird argument. Yeah. Because I think it would actually help his case if Tolkien came out and said, yeah, I sort of imposed some Christian ideas here. But what Tolkien's saying is, I didn't set out to write a Christian work, but when I did, that's what it was. Because that's how ingrained Christian conviction and Christian thinking is in Tolkien, and so naturally that came out in his work.
Yeah. So it's like an organic sort of process is really what we see.
Right. And as he goes into on various stories, he's, writing a not a made up world, but he's sub-creating a secondary world. There is reality behind it. And if Tolkien, as he obviously does, believes that Christianity is the real way of understanding the world, well, naturally then his secondary world is going to be born out of that conviction. And so there's that kind of obvious philosophical angle. But now if we're looking at what's inside the story itself, I mean, just go to the beginning of his legendarium, right? Go to the opening of the Silmarillion, and you clearly have one god creating the world kind of out of his thought, which at least initially you've got the Ainur sort of harmonizing, reflecting his glory. There's a clear monotheism from the very beginning that then works itself out in various ways, throughout the entire legendarium, up to the point where even in Lord of the Rings, towards the end of the quest, when Frodo's finally at Mount Doom, right? He doesn't even throw the ring in. Ultimately the main protagonist of that story is Eru, the god who kind of orchestrates even the depravity of Gollum to accomplish good ends. And so we see from really beginning to end of Legendarium, ultimately everything is kind of unfolding out of response to the person and actions of the monotheistic God. And so how you can go from that to then saying this is a fundamentally anti-Christian work, it's just absurd.
Yeah. And well, it is absurd because he's like twisting things that Tolkien, clearly says. He's ignoring whole swaths of the legendarium, and many of which you pointed out right there. On the other hand, there is the case, like, and I think he made some of these points in his article. There's kind of the case of, well, like, and somebody could without trolling, could genuinely ask this question, right? Well, if it's so Christian, then like, why are there all these other gods in it? I thought Christianity was a monotheistic religion. That's one of these questions that is a really interesting one, aspect to deal with, like how that all operates within the legendarium, and does that really align like with Christianity? And on the other hand, it's like, well, why isn't there any religion in in Lord of the Rings? If that's the case, right? Why, if it's so Christian, then why
Mhm.
doesn't it have more explicit, religious elements within it? I mean, how would you respond to even just like somebody honestly asking those questions?
Yeah, and those certainly can be questions asked with honesty. And my first response to the question of, okay, is this a Christian story? The why are there gods? Well, first of all, I think it's worth noting that there's only one uncreated deity,
Hmm.
right? And so right there, we see that when we talk about the gods or the powers, the Valar, we're talking about created beings. Okay, and even in the Christian text, that word, lowercase, you know, what we would classify as kind of lowercase gods, or the Hebrew, the Elohim, that can even apply to, say, the heavenly court,
Hmm. Oh,
essentially angels and sort of their role, in the world. And so I think there can be some analogs there with the Valar. Now, obviously, I'm not going to say one to one. Here's how Tolkien's creations match up with Christian theology, because as we said, it's not a straight allegory. However, I think thematically we can see some overlapping ideas here, that even as Christians we can talk about gods without betraying our monotheism, depending on the context in which we're doing it. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, so there, I mean, there's that. And
Solid
then,
answer. Solid answer. Yeah.
and then, oh, what was the other point that I'm responding to?
Just this idea that like, why doesn't religion like an active? Why don't the hobbits have religion, or like
Right,
why
right,
does
right, right.
religion play a more active role in the story?
Yeah, and I think that's first and foremost because while we do see Christian patterns of thought kind of embedded throughout the story, he's not setting out to write an allegory. He's not trying to say, um, he virtual. It's not Narnia, right? He doesn't need a character to almost literally come out and say, "I'm Jesus," in order to have Christological ideas kind of in the story. I mean, clearly we see examples of Gandalf, who, at least in a manner of speaking, dies and then resurrects in glory. We see the idea of the King Aragorn entering into his kingdom. We see the kind of priestly idea of Frodo kind of bearing the burden of the world up to the end. And so, on one hand, he simply didn't set out to write a Christian propaganda flick. He set out to tell a story, but in telling that story, we see these religious themes not here and there in isolated pockets like you would expect in Christian media today, but you simply see the Christian message all throughout the story in various types and shadows and just the way that he's thinking and telling good stories. Now, it's also worth noting that there actually is organized religion if you go back to Numenor.
Mhm.
So that's there. Um, and then Tolkien himself, even makes the point that, ultimately his story isn't about freedom. First and foremost, it's about God's sole right to worship, essentially, to divine authority.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to that one. And one other thing you said in your article, um, in just a minute. It's funny to me though, because I feel like Tolkien kind of with the I think he says in the same letter where he talks about it's fundamentally religious and Catholic.
Mhm.
He says the religious element is kind of absorbed into the text, which what he means by that is kind of like, that's kind of a head scratcher. Got to think kind of deeply about that one. But I think you explained a lot of that,
Mhm.
right? I think you explained a lot, like kind of how that works. But as you said, there like it turns out there are all of these. There actually is a religion in Middle Earth, and it's the Numenorian religion, and it looks something like a very like it's like a very it's monotheism, and it's the worship of Iluvatar, and actually, um, the the people of Valinor have a
Mhm.
religious cult, if you will, right? Like
Mhm.
literally the gods are worshiping Iluvatar. Like they have different times. It's kind of mentioned in passing at different times, but they talk about like having festivals, right? To Iluvatar, and there's some interesting things that happen with kind of the overlap between what Numenor's religious practice looks like and what Valinor's religious practice looks like. So it's almost like Tolkien, was like, I don't want to get real religious with this. And then like after he published it, he went back and he was
Right,
like,
right.
maybe I do need to flesh this out a little bit. And he went through
Right.
the process. Because of course the Numenorian writings, I believe, well, they do somewhat start concurrently with with Lord of the Rings, but he kind of detailed them out more probably after it was written. So yeah. Well,
Right.
well, this so this question of and I'm sorry, I kind of jumped in there with Numenor, but did you want to say anything more about like the Numenor, like the Numenorian religion and how that operates before I come back to this question about God and his sole right to divine honor?
No, that's fair enough. We can move on.
Well, yeah, and I mean they're essentially related, right? Like so, but you bring out this quotation in there, right? So Lord of the Rings is about God and his sole right to divine honor. That's in letter 181. And, another one of those that just like clearly refutes the thesis of this article. But what do you make of that quote? I mean, that's a really startling one to me too. Like, whoa, how does that work? Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I think that we see that playing out from the very beginning. Back to his creation myth. It really begins with the Song of the Ainur, who are singing in harmony, really in reflection of Eru's goodness, his divine authority. And where things really start to go wrong is of course where Melkor starts to play the progressive and sing his own tune, going off in a different direction. And that's really the beginning of things going wrong. And we see again and again the villains, whether great or small, throughout his legendarium, are those who desire power, right? Those who desire positions of authority that they simply aren't due and aren't equipped to wield. And so we see this idea of authority, the right authority, and misuse authority, all throughout his story. And so I think that's how we see that idea sort of playing out. It's those who grasp for power that ultimately are grasped by power, whereas it's those who, in humble obedience, right? Those are the heroes. Those who embrace humble obedience.
I love that line. Yeah, I don't know if you just came up with that spontaneously or if you can take that from somewhere else, but those who grasp for power are ultimately grasped by power.
Yeah,
that's a good one. But that's, yeah, I mean that's what that's just like right at the heart of this whole of Middle Earth, of the whole legendarium. That with this seeking after power, for its own sake or for making oneself great. That's like kind of the Melkorish perspective, and
right.
and
Yeah,
everybody.
and I think
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think we're even told at one point that Melkor did what he actually thought was good, right? He was trying to improve the world, but through his own eyes rather than through proper design and submission.
Yeah, and I mean, what what more like just constantly applicable notion could there be throughout like human history? I mean, in this quote, it's about God and his sole right to divine honor. He makes a juxtaposition between because some people want to say that the story is like fundamentally about freedom. I believe I'm trying to find this quote right here. And he says no, it's not actually fundamentally about freedom, but I think there's a propensity for people to feel threatened when they hear, oh, it's about God and his sole right to divine honor, and be like, well, are you telling me this is like some like domineering God who like demands honor and all this kind of stuff? I mean, that's not what Tolkien has in mind though, right? Like what do you
of
make,
course
like,
not.
how do we reconcile, like, I mean, because there is something about freedom in this story. It's just that it's not the primary thing, and it's maybe like what is Tolkien? What is Tolkien? put it this way. What do you think Tolkien wanted people to understand when he said something that bold, that strident, that probably will take a lot of people and make them be like, what?
Yeah, I mean, and this is one thing that one issue that a lot of people have, with Christianity, right? Obviously, God demands worship, um, but whether we're talking about Tolkien's mythology or Christian theology, either way, if God is supremely good, then it wouldn't be loving if he didn't call us to worship him,
Mhm.
right? He's calling us to our purpose. He's calling us to embrace that which is ultimately good. And so, really, that is true freedom, right? Simply being free to make your own arbitrary decisions and go in your own arbitrary way, that's not freedom. That's just spinning around in the abyss. I mean, real freedom is freedom to something, ultimately to the good, which is God.
You had this reminds me, there was a title of one of your episodes that was striking to me, and I think it kind of reflects this idea to need God as a human being's highest perfection.
Mhm.
Wow. Like tell us more about that. And is that a Kierkegaardian thing there?
Yeah, it is. That's actually the title of one of his little short essays.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and it's really straight to the point. And so Kierkegaard is known as the father of existentialism, which leads to all kinds of misinterpretations as to who he is and what he was doing.
Mhm.
Because most people, when they hear existentialism, they don't really think of the later secular existentialists who do really say, there is no up or down, sort of just create your own path and embrace it. But that's not what Kierkegaard was doing. He was very much a Christian thinker, who really was speaking against that understanding of freedom, which is exactly actually how he understood despair, right? Because true freedom requires freedom to something,
Mhm.
right? You need a point of origin and a destination. Otherwise, you're sort of floating in the sea. And so for Kierkegaard, what really makes humans unique and separates us from the animals is our ability to reflect on our nature as creatures, right? To recognize that we have a creator and to be able to have this willful embrace of our dependency on God. And so the more that we do that, the more authentically human we are, the more we're embracing what makes us truly unique. Whereas the more that we simply live off of kind of instinct and slavery to passions or arbitrary whims, really the more animalistic we're living. And that's just not freedom, not true freedom.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I love what you said, right? It's like you've got to have some like points of reference, right? Like where did I come from? Where am I going? And yes, is there kind of freedom within those constraints? Of course, but like I think it's not hard for most of us when we really think about it to understand that like this kind of like general like you're just completely free to do whatever freedom means to you. Um, that starts to cause us a lot of problems. Some might do more with that for a little while, but even then you're gonna kind of hit a wall with it. and and it's gonna you're gonna be pushed to limits of your humanity that you're gonna eventually find are like maybe that freedom wasn't such a good thing. Maybe that like totality of freedom wasn't such a good thing after all.
Right. And I don't think I say this much better than, Tolkien in Mythopoeia, right? Where he says in this stanza that I love, where he says, I will not walk with your progressive apes, erect and sapient, before them gapes the dark abyss to which your progress tends. If by God's mercy progress ever ends, and does not ceaselessly continue the same unfruitful course with the changing of a name. And so basically he makes this point that okay, you think that you're progressing toward something, but if you're just creating what that something is out of thin air, well then where is it that you're actually going? What are you progressing from and what are you progressing to?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so there's another you have another great line in this response that you wrote. Um, and I think this maybe gets to the heart of like Tolkien's idea of the religious element being absorbed into the story. But you say the religious is everywhere. What do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean by the religious is everywhere? thought it was just something that happens at church. I don't
Right.
know. I'm just kind of
Of course. I mean, ultimately, if the things that we believe are true, well, then they're true all the time, right? I mean, God is not bound to location. He's not bound to. I should be careful how I say this. He's not inherently bound to ceremony. He's not inherently bound to physical things. Now, he very well may communicate himself through such things. However, we're told that in Christ, all things are held together at all times, right? And this is the Christian understanding that all things were made ultimately through the word of God. And then, of course, John picks that up in the beginning of his gospel, where he says, in the beginning was the word, and the word is with God, the word was God. He was with God from the beginning, and all things were made through him. The idea here is that creation itself wasn't just set into motion, but is continually held in being and being directed by the transcendent God. And so religion isn't just something that we do. It's fundamentally the way that the world is, assuming what we believe is true.
Yeah. And and obviously this is the kind of like just general debate of back and forth at all times between just in general believers and atheists, right? Like someone who believes in we'll even just include like supernatural realities, right? We'll just say supernatural realities, as opposed to the atheist. And it's like, well, the atheist is just always like, why doesn't God just show himself, right? Why doesn't he just show himself? And they have something specific in mind, or kind of maybe general, but still something they'd like to see God do, right? To kind of prove that existence. Go ahead.
Yeah, and of course my basic response to that would be, why would you assume if God's real, he's going to act in the way that you think that he should? Yeah. If he would, he's probably not the transcendent God that we're talking about.
Well, and that's a great point. And one of the other sorts of things, and I think this is a relevant question to Tolkien, because this is kind of, I think Tolkien himself was working this out in Lord of the Rings, in the sense what you were pointing out earlier. Who is the ultimate protagonist of the story? Well, it's Iluvatar, right? Mm-hmm. He's orchestrating things behind the scene. He is the hidden presence who we know is there because he's there at the beginning of the legendarium, and he obviously creates everything. But how is he working everything out? And it's like, well, what's Tolkien saying about our world through that sort of scheme? And the thing that's dawned upon me over the years is just like, well, yeah, why doesn't God show himself? Or why don't I see him over here, like what in the ways that I would expect to see him? And it's like, it's that idea of the journey, right? That we're all on this journey to somehow discover him, right? And people think that, because you have kind of this religious, a set of religious ideas, that there's no sense of that maybe there's no sense of discovery within that. That's to misunderstand. That's like to misunderstand. It's like the religious ideas a lot of times are things that kind of give the general structure, and then but the actual relationship, the finding of God or the finding of Eru in the text, right? Those are things that you're kind of working out as you go, right? You're discovering as you go, you're finding as you go, just on this maybe that's an existential journey. Am I using that word right?
Yeah, I approve.
Yeah. I'm always I never have like studied existentialism or anything like that, but I always feel like I come back to being more or less an existentialist. Maybe that's just because I live in the late 20th and early 21st century, and that's how we all think. I'm not sure. You'll have to tell me. So I want to come back in a minute to Kierkegaard and Tolkien, but I just want to ask you, do you have some favorite? I mean, you've quoted some different passages from Tolkien tonight, but do you have any ultimate favorite passages from Tolkien, at least that you haven't quoted yet, or maybe a favorite work or favorite whatever of Tolkien?
Sure. So maybe I'll just kind of scattershot this approach. So one of my favorite quotes from Tolkien comes from the Quintus Silmarillion, which connects to some of the ideas I've kind of already talked about. But I'm just going to kind of read a couple lines here. And this is in talking about Olmo in particular. It says, "In the deep places, he gives thought to music great and terrible. And the echo of that music runs through all the veins of the world, in sorrow and in joy. For if joyful is the fountain that rises in the sun, it springs from the wells of sorrow unfathomed at the foundations of the earth." And I think that right there just captures how beautifully Tolkien interweaves joy and sorrow, which is a fundamentally Christian idea that ultimately, it is the cross of Christ, which is the ultimate kind of world tree connecting heaven and earth, right? And that's where reality is most keenly revealed. And I think that we see that idea throughout Tolkien's work. Now, to speak more broadly rather than specific quotes, man, I love the really lore heavy chapters. I love the Council of Elrond is easily one of my favorites. I love the deep dives into
We're very much alike, you and I. Yes.
Yeah. I even found myself just first read through Lord of the Rings. I hear a lot of times people talk about skipping over the poetry and the songs and whatnot that are all throughout, but I found myself trying to hold back the temptation of looking for the next one, because something about, I don't know, Tolkien's just poetic soul just really speaks to me. And so I love the lore, I love the poetry and the songs. Now, to kind of pick one particular text, aside from Lord of the Rings, obviously, I think my favorite story might actually be the Children of Hurin.
Wow.
As depressing and dark as it is, probably the same reason why I love Ecclesiastes. I don't know. I'm drawn to that kind of tone.
Existentialism, right?
Yeah, there's something to that.
Yeah. Interesting. Any more on why Children of Hurin? That certainly is. I'm sure there's actually a good number of people, because it is a really amazing story. It's just not the one that necessarily ends on the on the up note that we're kind of used to with other Tolkien stories.
Right. As a standalone story, it's definitely not, I wouldn't call it a fairy tale, right? There's no real eucatastrophe at the end. It just ends with you kind of feeling this emptiness in your stomach. But I think that might be kind of exactly why I like it so much, because if you look at the story in isolation, it's quite depressing. But then you recognize it's just one story amidst a much larger story. And so we can see that, as dark as particular episodes may be, it's still but part of the grander song that is unfolding over time. And so I think that even in this depressing story, essentially told through the eyes of Morgoth, that there's still hope and endurance to be found in such a dark place.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great answer. That's consoling to me, as you say that, because I'm a big fan. I'm a big history guy, and I really love the history of like the early 20th century, through World War II, and it's really depressing.
Yeah, for sure.
Just, the more you dive in, as fascinating as it is, the more you dive into it, you're just kind of like, wow, human beings are really awful to one another. Like, truly awful. Are we living in some kind of magical fairyland, like ourselves here, in this like time of relative, land and time of relative peace, I say. So but then again, somehow the shadow is just a passing thing, right? Like, it's
right.
Wow.
Right. And I think that's just one of the things I love about Tolkien, that on one hand, he's not optimistic about the future in a worldly sense. And it makes you think of from the Monsters and the Critics, when he's talking about Beowulf, and he refers to them as kind of defending their little circle of light against the oncoming monsters, and that ultimately it is a losing battle. But in the end, there's a long defeat followed by sudden victory in the end.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually just commented something about this on Twitter a couple days ago, that I was thinking about the Battle of Helm's Deep, that on one hand you have these noble men fighting against the hordes of monsters in this unwinnable situation, fighting to the end. And in that alone, you kind of have the Germanic heroism of the kind of Beowulfian spirit. But what makes it a Christian tale is, in the end, Gandalf comes and saves the day.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just that's like everything seems to be going wrong, and then out of nowhere. Yeah, seemingly out of nowhere, right?
Right.
Eucatastrophe. I was texting with another philosopher friend last night, and he was sharing something with me about that his one of his children, who I guess is into Lord of the Rings, was just like, who's really like even stranger than Tom Bombadil are the Eagles. Like they're just like, they just come out of like nowhere. They just appear out of nowhere. And then I texted my friend back and I said, well, the Eagles, the great Eagles, they're actually gods. They're actually gods. They're Maiar, according to Tolkien. So, kind of explains that there's a little more going on than just these giant eagles,
Right.
there. Well, okay. So we've talked a lot about Tolkien. We've talked a little bit about Kierkegaard. You're more of an expert in Kierkegaard than I am. I don't know if you'd call yourself an expert in Kierkegaard. I know lots of people have studied him, so you might still feel that kind of humble tension, but you know more about Kierkegaard than probably most people who've ever lived. So, and you also know a lot about Tolkien. So how do the two go together? Is there anything to kind of overlap and kind of connect that fascination for you?
Yeah, and so to be forthcoming about my expertise, I would call myself an expert on the few texts I've been working with for my dissertation. So I'll stick with that. He wrote a lot, but regarding specifically kind of his psychology, which is what I've really been focusing on, Kierkegaard does talk a lot about freedom, which really goes in line with the kind of freedom that we've been parsing out, right? It's the freedom to embrace your dependent existence on God, ultimately. And so he talks a lot about freedom. He talks a lot about kind of anxiety. And today we normally think of anxiety as an inherently bad thing, right? Something that we want to get rid of, whether it be through medication or avoidance, whatever. And I'm not commenting on psychiatric practice or anything like that. But my point is that for Kierkegaard, anxiety is not fundamentally a bad thing. What anxiety is our awareness that we're not self-sufficient. It's our awareness that we're creatures living in a world of change, and that we have a fundamental need for some kind of stability. And in fact, his treatment of anxiety very much goes in line with the Augustinian maxim that our hearts are restless until they rest in God. That idea is very much alive in Kierkegaard's psychology. Now, for Kierkegaard, if we ignore that kind of call to be authentic human selves that anxiety presents to us, well, that's when we fall into despair. And he even relates despair to the idea of the shadow, which obviously plays a pretty significant role in Tolkien's works, right? The shadow, is that kind of ultimately that nihilistic call to power, to inauthentic power that manifests itself in all kinds of different ways throughout the legendarium. And so ultimately for Kierkegaard, right, that symbolizes despair. It's a failure to be your authentic self in subordination to the good, which ultimately is God. And so I'm still kind of working out these connections in my own head. So I don't have a firm thesis, but at this point, I just kind of see some of these overlapping themes, and I'm still kind of working it out. Something I'd love to explore further once I finish out my dissertation.
Yeah, well, just that general idea of the shadow. I mean, it sounds like that plays an important role in Kierkegaard's thought. And obviously that's a huge concept in Tolkien's thought, right? So just that overlap there is an interesting point to dwell on for sure. But I love
Yeah.
this idea of like, it sounds like maybe, I mean, does Kierkegaard like kind of see it like see our anxieties as things we should sort of unpack and, and sort of be able to almost step outside of and be able to look at from the outside so that we can kind of master that? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, and so for Kierkegaard, we're never necessarily going to master our anxiety in the sense of no longer being anxious. For him to be human, right, as a contingent creature living in a world of time, we're going to be anxious because again, anxiety really signifies our kind of instability in the world, and so it's constantly sort of calling us to, become more solidified selves, to not latch on to things that are moving, right? To not, try to find stability by, as Solomon would tell us, grasping at vapor.
Mhm.
And so I totally forgot where I was going with this, to be honest.
Oh, no, don't grasp, don't
Yeah,
grasp.
don't grasp at vapor. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so that anxious call is always going to be there. And so it's something that we need to ultimately, embrace as, again, a call to be something more than changing circumstance.
Hmm. Gotcha. Yeah. Wow. Good stuff. It's good stuff. Well, I gotta ask, because this is the thing that you just got to talk about when
Mm-hmm.
we got fellow Tolkien fans on. You said when talking before, you said you have watched the first season of The Rings of Power.
Mm-hmm.
What was your reaction, being someone who is familiar with the texts and everything like that? What was your reaction to the first season of the show?
I mean, obviously, in the promotional lead up, I was kind of up and down depending on what was coming out. More down as it approached, but I obviously was going to watch it. There's no question about that. I figured this is a brilliant business move on their side because they're going to get people who love Tolkien and people who love to be upset about Tolkien, going wrong. And so either way, they kind of win with the Tolkien base. um, but I think overall, I've decided I can enjoy watching it if I understand it as Tolkien fan fiction rather than an adaptation of Tolkien. Uh, that kind of lowers the bar and makes it so I'm not quite so upset when they get things wrong, except for when they get things, more fundamentally wrong. Um, and so I guess in summary, I enjoy it. It's entertaining. It's not an adaptation as I would consider it.
Yeah, yeah, that seems to be the like, if you're not just I mean, there's lots of people, who are just kind of like, this is a monstrosity. They should be ashamed of themselves. And, and I know where they're coming from. Uh, but for the people who are just kind of like, yeah, that seems to be like kind of the general defense is like, I just look at it as Tolkien fan fiction. It's really expensive fan fiction,
And here's the thing: ultimately, we shouldn't necessarily expect that they're going to get it right. I know I'm not the first one to say this, but we've already talked about kind of the role of humility and sort of lowliness in the Tolkienian spirit. You can't necessarily expect that to come from Amazon.
Sure.
And so, of course, they're going to miss out on the spirit of Tolkien. And would Tolkien like it? Probably not. But I don't know. I'm okay accepting it as fun entertainment.
Yeah. Just it's I mean, I guess that's true of so many things in life, right? If you can just accept it for what it is, then it's a little easier to just enjoy it on its own. On its own.
And plus, I mean, here's the thing: I still feel like it is a net cultural good, simply because even if it is an echo of Tolkien, you still have Tolkien there in some capacity. Um, and I think that's good. Plus, at least when it comes to fantasy competitors in the media today, your Game of Thrones or whatever, it's not fundamentally nihilistic, and so I do think that there is something culturally beneficial there.
Although they did pick the story that's probably closest, that probably could have been like in detail told, like a Game of Thrones kind of thing.
Fair.
Towards the end of Numenor's history, it's like wow, things get really dark, really dark. But yeah. I mean, it's I think, season one's in the books. It's like, it is what it is, I guess, moving forward. But I do think that's the silver lining is, now there's gonna be a lot more people that want to know more about what he wrote about Numenor and about all these other aspects of the story, of the legendarium, that maybe weren't as familiar before. And also, it's just kind of fun to talk about too, when it comes to being fans of Tolkien. And even if we are, even if the majority of the talking is griping sometimes about it. So.
Hey, I mean, if we're honest, that's kind of fun too.
It is. Oh, it is fun. It's,
I mean, it reminds me of Frasier, who he says that the only thing better than a good meal is a bad meal you can complain about.
That's right. That's right. There's a lot of truth in that, for sure. For sure. Well, Andrew, this is a lot of fun. I really enjoyed just hearing about everything you've got going on. About your fascination with Tolkien, how that relates to your fascination with Kierkegaard. So just some really, really great nuggets of wisdom coming out of this. And we'll have to do it again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that.
Yeah, it'll be fun. Well, hey everybody, thanks for listening. Appreciate y'all being here. A lot of good stuff coming from the Tolkien Road in 2023. Make sure you give Andrew Snyder's podcast, Mythic Mind, go over and follow it. It's just a podcast right now, you don't have a YouTube channel or anything like that?
Right. Just the podcast.
Just the podcast. All right. So Mythic Mind, go over, check it out, subscribe. He's got a lot of good content about Tolkien over there. And then along the way, you're going to find some other content that's not even Tolkien related, but it's still pretty good because Andrew's talking about it. So go over there and check it out for sure. Mythic Mind. And is it mythicmind.com?
So the website is actually andrewinsnyder.com. And then you can find the podcast Mythic Mind wherever you get your podcasts.
Got it. All right. Fantastic. All right. Well, all right, Andrew, thanks again. And thanks to everybody for listening and or watching. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.